Before beginning the story, I'd like to say a big thank you for visiting my new channel. I'm going to be uploading alternate history-related stories every single day. If that sounds good, be sure to leave a like and don't forget to subscribe. It means a whole lot when just getting started. I hope you enjoy the story. Maps are arguments. I want to start there because most people don't think about maps that way, and the way you think about maps determines what you're able to read in them. A map is not a picture of a place. A map is a set of decisions about a place, what to include, what to omit, what to emphasize, what to minimize, all of those decisions made by a person with a particular purpose and a particular understanding and a particular idea of what the person looking at the map needs to know. The place itself does not have opinions about any of this. The map maker does. I have spent 15 years reading the decisions embedded in old maps. I am a cartographic conservator at a university library's special collections department. I preserve historical maps, restore damaged ones, digitize them, and assess their authenticity and significance. I understand maps at the level of paper and ink, and the particular way a trained hand moves across a surface when it is trying to record what it saw. I can look at a working map from the early 19th century and read not just the geography it depicts, but the state of mind of the person who drew it, whether they were confident or uncertain, whether they were in good conditions or difficult ones, whether they drew what they saw or what they expected to see. I am also, professionally, an expert in what gets removed. Erasure is a form of active choice. This is something I teach in the one graduate seminar I contribute to each year, and it is something I mean precisely. When a cartographer removes a feature from a map, they are not making the map less complete. They are making it differently complete. They are making an argument. The absence is as meaningful as anything present. If you know how to read absences, which I do, I'm telling you this because what I found on a Thursday evening in my conservation lab came to me through the specific skill of reading absences. I had been building toward time for weeks without knowing I was building toward anything. I thought I was doing routine conservation work on a donated collection. I was, technically. The routine work just arrived at a destination I was not expecting. The collection came to us from the estate of a private collector who had spent 40 years acquiring expedition-related materials. He died in his 80s, and his estate executor, a practical woman who clearly had no particular interest in the historical significance of what she was managing, donated the collection to the university with the attached note that some of it might be worth looking at. This is not uncommon. Collectors acquire broadly, and not everything they accumulate is what they think it is. The map was listed in the estate inventory as hand-drawn survey map, American West, circa 1805 to 1806, provenance uncertain. The executor flagged it as potentially significant because a colleague she consulted noted stylistic similarities to known core of discovery materials. She asked the university to assess it. The university asked me. I processed it initially as a probable period reproduction. This is the correct first assumption when a map arrives with uncertain provenance and significant claimed attribution. Reproduction maps made in the style of famous expeditions were common both contemporaneously and in later periods. People admired the work, They copied the style. They made documents that look like the originals and are not. My job is to find the difference. I ran my standard physical assessment. The paper dating was consistent with early 19th century American manufacture. The ink composition and aging patterns were consistent with the period. The handwriting style, cross-referenced against authenticated expedition materials, was in the correct range. None of this was conclusive. Paper and ink dating can be fooled, and handwriting can be studied and reproduced. I moved to the imaging. Multispectral imaging uses different wavelengths of light to reveal what visible light doesn't show. Underdrawings, faded text, corrections, and erasures. I run it on every map I assess because it is routine and because the things it finds are usually routine. Ink that has faded to invisibility, pencil underdrawings that the final ink layer covers, corrections made during the drawing process. The map showed evidence of deliberate erasure in the central region. I want to be specific about what I mean by deliberate because there is a meaningful difference between an accidental erasure, a spill, a smear, the ordinary damage of working in field conditions, and a careful, methodical removal of content that was previously there. The difference is visible under multispectral imaging in the pattern of the erasure, the consistency of it, the way the tool moved across the surface. Accidental damage is irregular. Deliberate removal is not. This was not accidental. Someone had worked carefully and consistently across a significant portion of the map's central region and removed whatever was there with the specific intent of leaving nothing readable behind. They did a thorough job. They did nearly a perfect job. Nearly. The ghosting that remained was not enough to read. It was enough to see that something had been there and to understand, from the scale of the removed area, that whatever it was had occupied a significant portion of the map. I documented what I could see of the ghosting, and I filed it as requiring further analysis. And I went home, and I thought about it for the rest of the evening, which is not what I usually do with conservation findings, because the work is usually not the kind that follows you home. This one followed me home. The first week, I did comparison work, which is standard procedure when a map raises questions. I built a working archive of every accessible Lewis and Clark cartographic material I could find in digitized collections, the known field sketches, the working maps produced during the expedition, the final published versions produced after their return. I laid them out in sequence, and I looked at what appeared in each stage of the process and what did not. I was looking for the gap, the place where the field record and the final published record diverge in a way that is not explained by the normal cartographic process. The normal cartographic process produces divergences. Features get added as understanding of the terrain develops. Features get adjusted as measurements are refined. Features get removed when they are found to be errors. All of this is normal, and most of it is documented in the expedition records. What I found was not this. In a section of the working maps covering a region of what is now the northern Great Plains, there is a feature present in two of the earliest field sketches that does not appear in any subsequent map. Not corrected, not relocated, not replaced by a more accurate version. Absent. The cartographers drew it in field conditions, then drew it again, and at some point between the field sketches and the next stage of the cartographic process, they made a decision that it would not be carried forward. No note explains the removal. This is unusual. The expedition records are meticulous about cartographic decisions. Changes are typically noted somewhere in the documentary record, a journal entry, a marginal notation, a correspondence reference. This removal has no note anywhere in the record that I could find. The notation beside the feature in the first field sketch was partially illegible, worn at the edge where the paper had been handled. In the second sketch, the notation was cleaner, and I could read most of it, accounting for the abbreviation conventions of the period and the specific handwriting patterns I had been working with. What it said was, "A place the land goes around." I read this several times. I made a note of it in my working file. I moved to the journals. I know the Lewis and Clark journals the way a conservator knows primary sources adjacent to his specialty. Well enough to navigate, not deeply enough to have read every line. I went back into them with a specific question, which is a different kind of reading than general familiarity. I was looking for the period of the expedition that would have put the core in the relevant region. I found the date range, and I read those entries carefully. The journals have gaps throughout the full record. This is consistent with expedition conditions and not inherently remarkable. Illness, difficult terrain, the practical demands of moving a large group of people through unmapped territory do not leave much time for writing. Gaps exist throughout the 2-year journey. This gap was 11 days. Both Lewis and Clark maintained independent journals, and their combined record has very few significant gaps. 11 days with minimal entries from both of them in the same period, in the region where the erased feature appeared on the field sketches. What entries existed for those 11 days were brief and practical. Weather observations, camp locations, supply inventory. Nothing that would draw a reader's attention without a specific reason to look, except one entry. Clark, 5 days into the gap, wrote a single sentence that had no connection to anything before or after it. We have agreed it will not be useful to describe this in terms that will require explanation. That is the complete entry for that day. I read it 4 times at my desk in the conservation lab. Then I got up and walked to the window and looked at the parking lot for a while, and then I sat back down and read it again. Clark was a meticulous journalist. His entries are detailed and sequential, and they connect to each other the way a careful person's written record connects, each day building from the last. A single uncontextualized sentence on an otherwise empty page is not consistent with his practice. He wrote that sentence knowing it was anomalous. He wrote it as a record of a decision made, not as a description of anything. The decision was the content, not useful to describe, not impossible to describe, not too frightening to describe, not useful. That is the language of a practical man who has weighed the cost and the benefit and found the cost too high. That is a man who has decided the description would cause a problem that the silence does not cause. I sat with that for the rest of the day. I contacted a colleague, a historian named Dr. Yara, who works on Great Plains indigenous history and who I had met at a conference 3 years prior and who I knew had spent significant time working with tribal archives and oral history collections. I sent her a careful email. I described what I had found, the erased feature, the notation, the journal gap, Clark's single sentence. I asked whether any of the nations whose territories had encompassed that region held oral traditions describing an unusual geographical feature, something that might be characterized as a place the land went around. She called me rather than emailing, which I noted. She said yes. She said there were references in oral traditions from multiple nations in the region to a place described with varying language across different cultural frameworks, but consistently identifying the same phenomenon, a portion of territory that animals avoided, that weather behaved differently around, that travelers with deep knowledge of the landscape routed around without being able to articulate clearly why, except that the land itself seemed to have made the same decision long before they were born. She said the traditions did not describe the place as dangerous. She emphasized this. Not dangerous, not a place of death or harm or hostile spirit, a place that existed in a different relationship to the surrounding landscape, the way a scar sits differently from the skin around it, not wrong and not harmful, just registering differently to whatever system of awareness takes note of such things. She said the traditions also noted consistently that the instinctive avoidance was not available to people who did not carry the accumulated knowledge of the landscape in the way that generations of living in a place will put that knowledge in you. That an outsider would not feel the difference. That an outsider could walk through the place and feel nothing. I asked what the tradition said happened to outsiders who walked through it. She was quiet for a moment. She said the traditions were not consistent on that point, and she did not want to characterize them beyond what the record actually said. Then she said, before I could ask another question, that the one point of consistency across sources was not about what happened, but about duration. The traditions referred to extended presence, not passing through, staying. She said she hoped my research went well and to let her know what I found. I thanked her, and I have not called her again. I spent 2 weeks sitting with the assembled evidence before I went back to the imaging. I had a ghost on a map. I had a gap in the journals. I had a single sentence from Clark that documented the existence of a decision without documenting its content. I had oral traditions from multiple nations describing a feature of the landscape consistent with the region and consistent with the field sketch notation. I had 2 field sketches showing something drawn carefully and then removed from every subsequent version of the record. I am a person who reads the decisions embedded in maps. I had been reading this one for weeks, and the reading kept arriving at the same place, which was that 2 of the most methodical observers ever to cross the American continent had found something in the northern Great Plains in 1804 or 1805 and had spent 11 days with it and had made a deliberate collective decision that documenting it would not be useful. These were men who documented rattlesnakes and bears and falls that could have killed their entire party. They documented everything that could hurt you. They documented the beautiful things and the difficult things and the strange things. They filled thousands of pages with the careful record of a landscape that no educated European had ever described. They looked at this and decided the description was not useful. I kept coming back to the detail Dr. Yara had shared, the instinctive avoidance not being available to outsiders. You would not feel it passing through. Lewis and Clark were outsiders. They walked through it, and they did not pass through. They stayed for 11 days. 11 days in a place that the land roots around in the specific, slowly accumulating way that things accumulate when you are present somewhere long enough. The traditions were not consistent about what happened to outsiders who stayed. The one point of consistency was duration. Lewis and Clark stayed for 11 days. They came out and they drew a careful boundary on a map, and they wrote a sentence about having agreed not to describe it. And then they erased the boundary from every map they had control over. I ran the final imaging pass on a Thursday evening after the department had emptied out. Multispectral imaging at the highest sensitivity settings is slow. The equipment works through a sequence of exposures at different wavelengths, and the processing time is significant. I set up the run, and I waited, and the lab was quiet around me the way climate-controlled rooms are quiet. The sound of preservation, the particular institutional hush of a place where things are kept carefully. The composite image assembled on my screen. The erasure had been thorough. Most of it was beyond recovery. But the ghosting in the highest sensitivity pass was better than any previous run, and what it gave me was enough to see the shape of what had been there. It was a boundary. A carefully drawn boundary around a section of territory in the specific cartographic convention Lewis and Clark used for bounded features on their working maps. The way you would draw a boundary around a lake or a significant landform, a deliberate line enclosing an area. What was inside the boundary was not labeled as terrain. It was not a geographical description. It was not a notation about resources or landmarks or navigational features. The notation that the erasure had not fully removed was a single word, and I sat with the screen close and my magnification glass, and I read it several times before I was certain I was reading it correctly, because I did not expect it to say what it said. The word was here, not a place name, not a geographical term. The word that means this location, this point, this exact place on the surface of the earth. They had drawn a boundary around a section of the American interior, and they had labeled it with the word that means I am pointing at this. Then they removed the pointing from every record they controlled. I sat in the empty lab for a long time. A boundary labeled here requires no explanation. It does not describe what is inside it. It does not characterize the feature or assess its significance or offer any information that would be useful to anyone who did not already know what here meant. It is simply a record of location. This is where. They removed the only record of where this is. Clark wrote, not useful to describe in terms that will require explanation. A boundary labeled here requires no explanation. It is the cartographic minimum, the least possible description of a location. They drew it, which means they wanted a record of where, and then they removed it, which means they decided even the record of where was more than the situation called for. I turned off the lab equipment and I drove home, and I sat at my kitchen table for a while. My conservation report on the map is accurate, and it is incomplete, and I have made my peace with both of those things, though making peace with the incompleteness took longer. The map is authenticated as a probable core of discovery working document. The physical evidence supports this. The cartographic analysis supports this. The erasure is documented technically in the report, the scale and method of it, the multispectral imaging results described in conservation language. I noted that the erasure prevents full recovery of the original content. I noted the comparison work with a known expedition record and the divergence in the northern Great Plains section, without characterizing the divergence beyond its cartographic description. I did not include Clark's sentence in the report, though it is part of the historical record and available to anyone who reads the journals carefully. I did not include Dr. Yara's information about the oral traditions. I did not include my interpretation of the notation recovered through the final imaging pass. The report is what the report is, and I know what I left out of it, and I know why. The map is in special collections with the appropriate catalog designation. The full imaging results are on a personal drive in my apartment, backed up in one additional location I control. They are not on the department server. I have thought about this decision from a number of angles. I am a conservator. My professional purpose is to make the historical record more complete. I have spent 15 years working toward that purpose, and I believe in it. And I have documented things that were uncomfortable and things that were politically inconvenient and things that required careful institutional handling. And in all of those cases, I believed the complete record was worth more than the comfortable one. This is the first genuine exception I have made in 15 years of this work. Clark made the same exception in 1805 or 1806, and he was a more capable and experienced observer than I am, and he had 11 days of direct exposure to make his assessment, and I have a ghost on a map and a sentence in a journal and an oral tradition I cannot characterize clearly and a single recovered word. He had more information than I have, and he reached the same conclusion. I find that either very reassuring or not reassuring at all, depending on the day. I have not settled on which. I have driven across the northern Great Plains twice, both times on research-related travel, long days on the interstate with the land flattening out and the sky doing what the Great Plains sky does, which is expand in every direction until the horizon is the only boundary, and the only sound is the road and the wind working at the car and the particular quality of light that comes from a sky that wide. I find it beautiful in the way I find most large, quiet things beautiful, which is at a slight remove, appreciative, but not moved. I drove through the relevant region both times without knowing what was in it. I felt nothing unusual. This is consistent with what Dr. Yara told me. The instinctive avoidance is not available to someone who has not grown up with the landscape's accumulated knowledge of the place embedded in them. You would not feel it. An outsider could pass through and feel nothing. Passing through. Lewis and Clark were outsiders, and they stayed for 11 days, and they came out of it and removed a labeled boundary from a map and agreed not to describe what they had found in terms that would require explanation. The difference between me driving through on the interstate and the core of discovery crossing on foot in 1804 is not what we were. It is how long we were there. I live in the Midwest. I drive through that landscape several times a year. I do not know precisely where here is, because the word here on a removed map notation does not give me coordinates, and the boundary it labeled has been erased too thoroughly for me to establish its edges with precision. Here is somewhere in a region the size of several eastern states, and I do not know which part of it. I have decided that the imprecision is the correct amount to know. I have decided this deliberately, and I have left it alone. Clark wrote, "We have agreed it will not be useful to describe this in terms that will require explanation. I described it in my lab and in my working files and in the privacy of my own thinking, and I arrived at the same place he arrived at, which is that the description does not improve the situation, and the situation is large enough already. The boundary is labeled here on a personal drive in an apartment in the Midwest. Here is somewhere out there in the flat, wide, patient landscape that has been there since long before the core of discovery walked through it, and will be there long after the interstate that runs through it is as historical as Lewis and Clark are now. What is inside the boundary is still there, has always been there. The map being erased did not change what the map was pointing at. I drive through that country, and I feel nothing, and I keep driving, and the sky is very large, and the land is very flat, and the road runs straight through all of it, for miles and miles and miles in every direction. I keep driving. It is the correct thing to do. Lewis and Clark knew that too.